Well, Dan and Miquel, thank you very much for being here with us in Grayling. I mean, today is the day to speak about Brexit. Sitting down with a British MEP, Spanish journalist, very focused, with a big focus on business. So let's start from the beginning, Dan. So why Brexit, first of all?
Democracy. The right that you to hire and fire your own lawmakers, the right to govern yourself as an independent country. If that had been something that could have been renegotiated from the inside, there would have been no Brexit. But when David Cameron came back without any recovery of power at all in 2016, I think a Leave vote became almost inevitable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you see any chances of a second vote right now at this stage?
You have to allow a theoretical possibility because we're in such uncharted waters, but I think it is highly unlikely. I'd put it at below 10%. The more likely options, as I see it, are that we leave with no deal and find ways of smoothing that, or that we join EFTA, or that we leave on the basis of a deal that is modified from the current one. The current withdrawal agreement has 585 pages. Almost all of the criticism is of the 175 pages that pertain to the Irish backstop, and that's why it will not pass the House of Commons. That's why this deal can't go through. My guess is that if it falls, that probably a new Prime Minister will say, well, should we at least salvage the uncontentious bits? Reciprocal rights for citizens who live in each other's countries, this kind of stuff. And it's impossible to know how the EU 27 will respond to that, but it would seem to me odd to refuse to agree the stuff that is plainly in the interest of all sides and has been agreed, other than the Irish backstop.
Okay. Going a little bit into the business, and then I think Miquel could also add some of his experience. You are an MEP. You get a lot of visits from different companies. Mm-hmm. What are they saying, and what are they worried about? Are they worried? Maybe they're not.
Well, it depends, of course, which companies you talk to. Under any economic system, however irrational it is, however arbitrary, people learn to adapt to those rules and then become resistant to any change. So, by and large, the very big multinationals who have learned how to game the system here, who employ huge teams of lobbyists in Brussels, who have been able to get EU rules that favour them and hurt their competitors, they oppose any change at all. Because any change for them, even if it were in the general interest, would be against the specific interests of those dominant companies. The role of the politician, though, is also to think about the smaller company, the startup, the entrepreneur, the companies that don't yet exist. And the Brexit outcome for us should be a balance where we also allow the freedom to innovate, the freedom to trade globally, the freedom to experiment outside the EU regulatory model, and to have the innovation and the productivity gains that come from that. And by definition, those are not the companies that you hear from in the Confederation of British Industries, because some of them don't exist yet and others are very small. But I can't help noticing, for example, that since the Brexit vote, there has been the most immense relocation of US tech companies to London from the rest of the EU. And although they're too polite to say this in so many words, I'm pretty sure that has to do with a belief that the regulatory framework from a post-EU Britain will be more friendly than in the European Union.
Okay. Miquel, from your experience, you've been writing for many years here in Brussels. What's your take from the entire Brexit developments that take us to where we are at the moment?
I'm not so sure it's a question of democracy, because if it was a question of democracy that it's solved just with a referendum, for example, there wouldn't be any problem to make a second referendum, just maybe not to ask again if the UK wants to leave or remain, but maybe if people agree with the new to where is
the problem
Brexit
with that,
going
Miquel, is that everybody was so clear that there wouldn't be a second referendum, especially the people on the Remain side. The government said so, David Cameron said so, a pamphlet was sent to every house saying there will never be another vote, this is
Sure.
it. That's the problem.
Yeah, sure. The thing is that when facts change, people is allowed to change of opinion. So if you are told that you will have 350 million pounds per week to fund the NHS, and then that's not true, so maybe
394 million has been announced.
Yeah, sure. But what you can do, I mean, I agree that you can't ask again the same question you asked 2 years ago. But maybe you can ask people if they agree with this no-deal scenario that you think is so likely right now.
But let me ask you something. I agree you could have a referendum on a different question. But that surely would mean that the EU would be having to offer a different proposition. So if the European Union were to come back and say, well, if you didn't want to be a member on the old terms, maybe you would like to be members on a looser basis. We don't say a better or a worse, but we think it's worse. You might think it's better, but a looser. You opt out of everything except the market. You opt out of common foreign policy, criminal justice, whatever. That would be a reasonable thing on which to have a second referendum.
There were plenty of doubts before.
Well, I see absolutely no evidence that anyone in Brussels is prepared to contemplate making any offer like that.
So on that note, Dan, so what would be the key scenario from your point of view to actually have a second referendum?
Well, like I say, it would need to be on a substantively different question. In other words, the terms being offered, the basis of our membership would have to be different. If David Cameron had come back in February 2016 with some retrieval of power, with some principle that power could be decentralized as well as centralized, something that has never happened, I think that would have satisfied a lot of people. If he had come back and said, well, we are members now only of the economic sort of single market stuff, but we've opted out of everything else, I can't imagine there have been huge objections in the other 27 countries to opting out of the provisions on citizenship, culture, media, sport, this kind of. But that the EU, when the moment came, the EU was readier to lose its second largest financial contributor than to allow any power to be devolved. And ultimately, I think that's why the vote went the way it did.
Okay. Miquel, one of the key, we were talking with Dan about companies, and you've been writing a lot about companies as well. What's your take? What do you think about what companies think? And do you think they're nervous? Do you think they need any answers to their questions, or do you think?
I think there's two groups of companies in Spain right now. One is the ones that have a huge market in the UK and huge interest and have done plenty of investments in the past. Santander, Telefónica, Iberdrola. They are big players in the European landscape, and now they don't know exactly what will happen with the business, the UK business. That it's very important for them. And then the other ones, I think it's more related to the tourism sector. And there's worries, but what will happen after 29th of March? Because, of course, if there's a no deal, if the cliff edge scenario becomes real, there's a huge question mark what will happen with travel, logistics, transportation, and the tourism is a very important sector in Spain, and the UK is a very, very important part of that sector. So I think if something has brought us this process is uncertainty and fear. From both sides. I don't know how we can have anything positive from that.
It would be extraordinary, though, wouldn't it, to say that there was going to be a restriction on travel? We don't have visas from Nicaragua, from Nauru, from Namibia, right? I don't think there's any question that we would be imposing visa requirements from allies in Europe. It would be bizarre also to have it the other way around. I think it's been pretty much confirmed that it wouldn't. Planes landing, right? Which is you hear this here in Brussels in the Commission. Oh, well, there may not be a deal on aviation. You may not have your guaranteed landing slots. The EU did not ban Iran's airlines when they were sponsoring terrorism. It didn't prevent Russian airlines landing after the invasion of Ukraine. Are we really saying that making use of a right constitutionally recognized in the treaties to withdraw is a more hostile act than sponsoring international terrorism or invading Ukraine, that it would be met effectively by a blockade? Because if so, we're saying something quite extraordinary about the Brussels institution.
I think it's not something about political will. I mean, I'm not here to defend the institutions, but I think it's more about technical complexity and about how to deal with a cliff edge scenario in which you have for 40 years you have been playing with the rules in a framework, in a legal framework that gives certainty, and now this framework disappears. And no, it's.
But isn't the likeliest thing, I mean, I understand that, of course, but isn't the likeliest thing in that scenario that both sides would say, let's just roll over on a practical, logistical basis, at the coalface, if you like, let's roll over the existing arrangements pending a long-term settlement, so that when it comes to aviation, police cooperation, exchange of information, customs procedures, that you can carry on just as you're doing it now, until there is a final
settlement. That's
settlement.
the transition period. And the transition period means that you are still in a way, because you have still access to the internal market. You still have to pay for this access. So I mean, that's the transition period. But the transition period is part of the deal. It's conditional. So
I think no deal is now the single likeliest scenario, and because of this quite bizarre Northern Ireland backstop, which is not part of any normal sort of deal among countries. And the interesting question is, how is that handled? Because I think if it were up to the Spanish government or the Polish or the Italian or the Swedish government, they would say, let's try and make things work as much as possible in the advantage of our own citizens. So of course. The Spanish companies you spoke about have an interest in the free flow of capital, and the Spanish tourism industry and so on all have an interest in things working. And we have an interest in the prosperity of our neighbours, right? We want to have rich neighbours. We want them to be good customers. We want them to be secure. They're our friends. They're our allies. The only contrary voice one hears is sometimes from Eurocrats, not from people in the 27 capitals, but from people in the EU institutions, saying, no, there has to be a price, we have to be, there has to be seen to be a cost paid. So I say it would be an odd thing to impose, as it were, greater sanctions on the UK than on Putin's Russia, which is ultimately what a ban on aviation would be.
I mean, I don't think it's paying a price. I mean, it's the simple fact that a non-member cannot have the same benefits than a
So you
member.
have the same, but when we're talking about the same access that a non-member has, right? That like Japan
or Norway or Canada,
right?
But you don't like that as well, so neither. So
you mentioned the Irish border as well, and out of the 585 pages of the withdrawn agreement, we keep talking about the border. I mean, can you elaborate a little bit?
So the rest of the agreement, it's not the way I would have wanted, but all of it is acceptable. It's a compromise. It's not the way that anyone would have 100% wanted it.
It's temporary.
It's temporary. But the agreements on reciprocal rights for citizens, I think, are uncontentious. The agreement on the money, we think that we're paying too much, but look, it's not worth falling out with friends about it. The problem is this regulatory annexation of Northern Ireland in the event of, in what's called the backstop, in the event of no deal, which I think loads the incentives in such a way that the EU would have no reason to discuss a final deal, because it would have kept Britain in the customs union in perpetuity. That's why the deal isn't going to pass Parliament. And this is where it's not true that the EU is following its own rules. First of all, the EU often doesn't follow its own rules. The bailouts were plainly against the rules, the budget deficits, the appointment of Selmayr. I mean, it breaks its rules all the time, we all know that. But it specifically isn't following its own rules here. It isn't offering either the kind of deal that it has with the EFTA countries, because it's saying you would also have to be in the customs union, which of course Norway and Switzerland and so on are not. Nor is it offering the kind of free trade deal that it has with Canada. Because it isn't saying to Canada, we will only have a free trade deal with you if the provinces of New Brunswick and Labrador are under EU regulation. So it's offering a worse deal than it offers either to immediate neighbours or to other countries. And I think that's why it won't pass. Now, my guess, this is only a prediction based on a hunch, but my guess is that if the deal is rejected, that the UK government, presumably headed by somebody else, because I can't see how Theresa May could remain as Prime Minister after that, would say, well, okay, if we can't do that deal, which bits of it do we all agree are uncontentious? And I suspect that in return for the money, there will be a transition deal, there will be agreed right. I mean, you know, as you know, having lived in London, you can't move in London without hearing Andalusian accents, right? We don't. Right. What would we do if suddenly everyone left, right? We've come to regard our Spanish neighbours in London as friends and family, right? Mm-hmm. So all of that bit should be easily resolved. Okay.
You just mentioned right now you don't think May will survive. Is this? Do you think? Today's was it Wednesday today? Sunday's a big day in Brussels. 27 heads of the different member states will join together and decide big things. You think this is going to happen before that? After that? This is going to be before Christmas?
I think the crunch point will come when the withdrawal agreement is voted down by the House of Commons. And it will be voted down by lots of different people with different motives. It will be voted down by the Labour Party, by the Scottish National Party, by some Eurosceptics, and by some people who want a second referendum. The government is now in this rather sort of odd position of saying to the Eurosceptics, you have to vote for this or we might not leave, and simultaneously saying to the Euro enthusiasts, you have to vote for this or there'll be no deal at all. Now, plainly, both of those things can't be true. And in my view, actually, neither of them is true. Mm-hmm. I think there will be a more minimalist deal will be agreed in its place. But at that stage, having been defeated on the centrepiece of her policy, it would be quite difficult to see how the Prime Minister could stay on. And either there'll be another election or more likely there'll be a change of leadership in the Tory party and a new Prime Minister will command a majority.
Okay. Now going to the 29th of March, so it's day one after Brexit. What's happening that day?
My guess is that it will look just like the day before. It's the beginning of a process. It's the beginning. So we've had, as Miquel was saying, we've had 45 years of aligning all of our rules. All of that remains in place. Under the terms of the withdrawal, everything that has been adopted as members of the EU is automatically put into our statute book. So the day we leave, we have the same regulatory system, we have the same standards, we have the same compatible rates of indirect taxation, all of that we have as members. Brexit is a process rather than an event. It's the beginning of a reorientation towards a more global trading pattern, which, by the way, is if you like, an argument that doesn't apply to every other country equally. People often say, well, you know, if Brexit is such a good idea, why is nobody else doing it? One of the answers to that is Britain is usually, most years, the only country, some years one of two countries, that does more trade outside the EU than in it. Right? We've always had a different economic profile from the other members. And the argument that you should agree common rules on everything is much stronger if you're Belgium and 80% of your exports go to the EU than if you're Britain and it's 44% or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so I think we will see Britain, if you like, reverting to the kind of global commercial supply lines that it had up until membership in 1973, where we do an increasing amount of our trade with North America, South America, Africa, mm-hmm. Asia, and Australia.
Mm-hmm. And Miquel, from your experience and what you have been gathering until this point from companies that you talk to write your articles, what do you think this first day is going to look like?
I think they are not that sure that it will be as the same day before, because everything depends on how both sides, London and Brussels, try to mitigate that, try to put cushions and try to build up barriers to avoid a big mess. Mm-hmm. Because legally the UK will be a third country, so automatically There will be custom tariffs. There will be more barriers than the day before. And of course, I mean, there will be a moment, maybe January, maybe, I don't know, the moment in which, maybe when the House of Commons votes down the deal, that someone who has to say, okay, here there will be a train crash. We have to prepare for that. At least that when the train arrives to the central station to hit, maybe try that it's going in at a low speed and not at full speed, and try to mitigate these things.
I think it would be almost unthinkable that the UK would impose tariffs on the EU. In the days after leaving, I think it would be, I mean, in order to be WTO compliant, we will have to reduce some of our tariffs with the rest of the world, but we want to do that anyway, right? So there won't be, if you like, any delay with imports to the UK, nor do I think we will have any extra checks on phytosanitary standards or anything like that, because we'd say, look, we understand the standards of all these countries. We've had it for 40 years. What happens on the other side of the channel, of course, is not up to us. But
yeah, I mean, it is true. We as a company, as Grayling, we do work with different companies, UK companies, German companies, American companies, Spanish companies, and we've been doing a lot of work in what we call the Brexit tax force, right? So these are companies that are actually worried about what's going to happen afterwards. These are companies that have factories in the UK and they export a certain amount of their production to Spain or somewhere else. And something that is common is that every single company doesn't know exactly what's going to happen. So that brings a level of uncertainty that is very, very dangerous when it comes to business. So my question is, given this situation, what's your advice? What will you say to a Spanish company that is in this situation, that is, either buying some goods from UK factories or producing some goods in the UK and then exporting to the rest of Europe?
Well, I would say don't worry. And the reason I would say don't worry is I would say look at the same forecasts about what would happen in the immediate aftermath of a leave vote. Look at what the same people who are now predicting disaster in the event of WTO Brexit were predicting would have happened by now. We were told during the campaign, not by the Remain campaign, fair enough that they should be making exaggerated claims, but we were told also by the IMF, by the OECD, by the British Treasury, by the Bank of England, that the stock exchange would collapse. In fact, it's broken every record. We were told that unemployment would go through the roof. We were told by the Treasury that by now, 2 years after the vote, there would be at least 500,000 more unemployed people in the best case scenario. In the worst case scenario, 830,000 more. In fact, unemployment has fallen by 500,000. There are more people in work than ever before in British history. Exports are up, manufacturing output is up, consumer confidence is up, growth is up. We've grown more quickly since the vote than in the equivalent period before it. More startups have been launched since the vote than the equivalent period before, and investment is higher than it's ever been. So when exactly the same people now turn around and say it will be the end of the world, look at their record as forecasters.
But that's because you were right, because Brexit is not an event, it's a process. And the thing is that on March 29th, the reality starts kicking in. And it starts with tariffs. And maybe the UK won't impose tariffs to a Spanish exporter, but a Spanish importer of British goods, we'll have to pay that tariff, and British products will be more expensive and less competitive, and Spanish.
Well, that will be a decision for the EU. I mean,
sure,
but viewers of this program will know, because they understand economics, that tariffs are always much more damaging to the country that imposes them than any incidental damage to exporters from elsewhere, right? So this is why I think it would be crazy for Britain to do it, and I think it is unlikely that the European Union would. But if the European Union were wholly interested in economic rationality, it wouldn't have launched the euro in the way it did. It wouldn't have stuck to it in the way it did. So I can't say that for sure.
And just finally, to wrap her up, before we go into Spanish a little bit, if you feel comfortable to, there is a, as I was saying, companies very worried about what's going to happen, but at the same time, there are companies that do believe that these are opportunities. So what are those opportunities that the UK, after Brexit would bring to companies, and at the same time, if you want to comment a little bit the influence of the UK after Brexit, for example, towards the European elections.
Brexit on its own doesn't add one, cent to the national economy. It removes constraints. And how we use our new freedoms will define how competitive we are as a country. But potentially, Britain is a services-based economy. It is a world leader in certain sectors, in biotech, in education, in financial services, in legal services. Potentially, orienting to a more global role and having the freedom to set our own regulations in our own interests will allow us to expand those sectors immensely. I mentioned earlier there's been a huge shift of tech companies from Dublin and from the continent to London since the vote. I think this is because they don't like all the the talk here. They hear about taxes on the internet and all the rest of it, and regulations and bans on copyright and so on. And I think the same will be true of things like clinical trials and so on. There will be opportunities for a country to run its own financial and economic regulations according to its own conditions and needs. And I'm confident that 10 years from now, people are going to look back and say, why didn't we do this much earlier?
Mm-hmm. And from the influence point of view, from the UK, coming out of this big market, how is the UK going to influence?
Obviously, we will have less influence in how the rules are set here in Brussels. Of course, that's the trade-off. But we are, in consequence, able to take our seat again around those global tables where it matters. So when we speak at the World Trade Organization or when we speak at the various UN technical standards agencies that lay down the rules on food or cars or finance or whatever, instead of being represented by 1/28th of a European Commissioner, we will be represented as our own right, as the fifth largest economy in the world. And I think we can push the world in a more economically liberal direction. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I hope comes out of Brexit is that we use it to revive a stalled world trading system and to have a more liberal approach to global commerce.
And finally, do you think we are within the lobbying industry, very popular here in Brussels and becoming very popular in Spain as well? Do you think from the lobbying point of view, is it going to be more opportunities for companies to actually lobby in the UK? There's going to be a lot of regulation at the moment.
I can't avoid pointing out that the companies that spend the most on lobbyists here, particularly some of the big American banks, were the strongest in wanting to keep the old system going, because of course they were heavily invested in it. The last thing they want to do is to have to start all over again with a new set of British regulators. But I don't think that the number of lobbyists thronging Brussels is necessarily a sign of the health of the EU economy, let alone its democratic system.
Okay. And finally, Miquel, how do you see the UK's influence after this March 2029?
I know. I think it's there. I mean, if you think that with the 1% of the world population you will have any influence in the World Trade Organization or in the IMF or so on, I mean, I think it's hard to see how the UK can be more influential by its own than in a EU at the 20. I mean, that shaping the policy of the EU at the 28 and then pushing for this policy. I mean, I think the free market mentality of the UK politics has done a lot of good to the EU. Has been a very good counterbalance to other more pro-government, countries, and I think it has succeeded the UK in doing that. I mean, somehow. I mean, imagine when you ask to people in France or how they perceive the EU, they say that it's like the center right and the liberal in a European way organization. Mm-hmm. And you ask in other countries and they perceive it to be in the left. So this this difference, I mean, I think shows that the EU is more or less balanced, and I think part of the merit it's of the UK, and we will miss you. I mean.
I mean, on that note, something that just came back to my mind. How important is the Commonwealth? And maybe you want to talk a little bit about this Conservative International, very interesting project.
Well, one of the things I've been looking at in the last couple of years is whether we could do trade differently with other like-minded countries. So most trade deals now are done on the basis of common regulation. You know, if you want to sell a car, we have to agree that this is, you know, how the indicator works, and this is what the permissible level of carbon emissions is, and so on. And that's the usual way of doing things: standardization, common regulations. I think a much better way of doing trade is mutual recognition. You call it a car, fine, we trust you. You know, and if it then ends up killing someone then the company will be sued, of course, just like one of ours would. But that you don't keep out another product on grounds of nationality. You say whatever you guys call legal, we recognize. And this is something that I think we could do with other wealthy, advanced economies, but particularly those that have the same common law system that we have, because the regulations are shaped by the same mentality, the professional qualifications are similar, and so on. So I'm looking at whether we might get a global network of English-speaking common law democracies, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Hong Kong, and so on, that would be able just to have if you like, a nexus of mutual recognition that would extend to goods, to services, and to professional qualifications. That if a drug is approved in one, that's good enough for all of the others. If somebody is qualified to practice as an architect or a lawyer or a doctor in one, he can practice in all of the others. I think that's a way of extending consumer choice, and I also think it's a way of reviving the free market system, of making it a system that works for the consumer rather than for the cartel, that makes it work for the little guy rather than for the multinational.
Okay, that's great. Very interesting, your Conservative International project. Very interesting. Okay, well, on that note, I think this is all. So thank you very much, Miquel, and thank you very much, Dan, for being here today with Grayling. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.